Welcome to all our listeners. Welcome to the Intra-African Trade, Water Inequality and the Tigrayan Crisis episode of Ubuntunomics podcast. This week we'll be looking at the 2021 Intra-African Trade Fair, the water inequality in South Africa, tax policy proposals for the 2022 budget, the slow progress in Sudan, the SADC joint meeting on HIV/AIDS, the impact of CAR conflict on children, and Ethiopia's deepening crisis. With me this week is Sbu Nyati from Isakombe Assets. Hello Sbu, how are you doing this week?
I'm fine, thank you. See, all is well. How are things your side?
I'm very well, thank you. I can't complain. And with us this week as well is Zama Matungandaba from M&M Legal. Hello Zama, how are you doing this week?
Hey Sia, I'm doing well, thanks. How you guys doing?
Well,
very well, thank you.
I missed you guys.
We missed you too, and welcome back, Zama. And a reminder for all our listeners, on whatever platform you're on, hit the subscribe button to stay up to date with all future episodes. And if you're enjoying this episode, hit us with a like or share it amongst your family and friends. And let's get started with the essay update this week. Our first story is set-top box rollout. The South African Post Office SEPO has reiterated its call for qualifying households to apply for free set-top boxes as the country prepares to migrate to digital broadcasting on the 31st of March 2022. The government is subsidizing set-top boxes for households that depend on social grants and those with a monthly income of less than 3,200 Rand, as long as the households have a functioning television set and a TV license. Currently, almost 60,000 households have applied for the government-subsidized television decoder in October, and the leading provinces are the Eastern Cape, Northern Cape, and KwaZulu-Natal. Households that missed the registration deadline of the 31st of October may receive their decoder only after the 31st of March 2022. Zama, you had a question about the story on what exactly are set-top boxes and digital broadcasting.
Yes, I'm really, wondering and really interested what prompted the move into digital broadcasting and what are the benefits? So why are we doing this? What are we trying to achieve by this migration?
Sure. Look, I think it's generally a reflection of the changing times. Most broadcasters, you might know, that are definitely digital these days, and most people consume media via digital platforms, whether that be on their cell phones or computers, and generally on streaming services. And so what this move is a shift from our current analog broadcasting, which is a sort of old technology used for broadcasting, still being used in South Africa as a sort of main form of public broadcasting, into a digital broadcasting. Currently, obviously, there is existing digital broadcasting, but mainly via private subscription providers, such as your DSTV. Via MultiChoice. So what this move and migration is doing is putting the public broadcasting on a digital broadcast nowadays. Sbu, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, my thoughts are that this is another process that is not entirely reflective of the conditions on the ground. These numbers are baffling. I mean, only 60,000 applications in a population of close to 60 million people. What does this mean? Because it is a known fact that 55% of the population lives below the poverty line. So there should be more takers. Another interesting point is that the leading provinces are all rural, whereas the vast majority of people are urban dwellers. Then there is the point about having a functioning TV set and a television license. I mean, the SABC has for the past decade bemoaned the fact that TV licenses are not paid by people in general. In fact, they are looking for a better financing model So maybe this is why there are so few applications in urban areas where people only start worrying about paying TV licenses when they have to buy a new set. So there's also the DSTV factor, where many people already have satellite dishes for receiving the signal. So it's still, it baffles me as the numbers just don't reflect our reality.
Definitely agree with you on that one, and I think it's largely due to this sort of selection criteria or qualifying criteria of having a TV license, like you said, and again, the other factor being the DSTV factor. But we know for a fact that in 2019-2020, there were over 18 million South Africans who depend on social grants. So definitely these numbers don't reflect the reality on the ground. On that note, that takes us to the next story in the SA update, Intra-Africa Trade Fair 2021. South Africa hosted the 2021 Intra-Africa Trade Fair IATF conference in Durban from the 15th until the 21st of November. The week-long IATF conference provides a platform for linking international buyers, sellers, and investors. In addition, participants and visitors can profile and share market information and investment opportunities in support of intra-African trade and the economic integration of the continent. Speaking at the conference, President Cyril Ramaphosa called for the concerted effort to increase intra-Africa trade in order to change the distorted trade relationship that exists between African countries and the rest of the world, and for the IATF to inspire African youth. Sbu, you had a point to make about the whole conference and the idea behind it, as well as the role of the Afrexim Bank, who is the main sponsor behind the IATF.
The development and the baby steps that they are taking are all welcome. This conference is a welcome thing. Now, as we move forward, the mandate of the African Export-Import Bank which you mentioned, the Afrexim Bank, it needs to be augmented in my view, because they say they provide a platform for linking international buyers, sellers, and investors, as well as allowing participants and visitors to profile and share market information and investment opportunities in support of intra-African trade and the economic integration of the continent. Now, I think that this is what needs to be augmented, that the role of the bank should include commercial activity that includes export credits and investment loans, mainly in infrastructure fields such as roads, things like oil and gas pipelines, telecoms, electrical energy generation, logistics logistics networks and those kind of things. They could do this by advancing concessional loans at no interest rate, or at a low interest, not just depend on the African Development Bank, because most companies or most development in Africa we go for the African Development Bank or other international funders. So we need a specific financier, in my view, that deals with trade and implementing the policy objectives of the African Free Trade Agreement. So I saw even at the conference some SMEs with stands. They were selling consumer items like shea butter. Some were selling oils. Some were selling fruit juices, and some ICT services. These are positives. No, don't get me wrong. But what I think is that Africa should be trading in what it already trades in, mainly primary goods and resources. We must utilize the continent's raw materials, to increase trade amongst ourselves, and to capacitate our industrial increase our industrial capacity. Yeah. So trade among and within the continent has to go into things like infrastructure. I think they should finance the construction of linkages and networks, and they should, because this is where the big money is at. And basically, basically what we should be doing should be copying or copying the US or the Chinese import-export banks. That model, that's what the Afrexim Bank should be doing, in my view. Not just be a platform, just we need someone to finance trade.
Sure. Look, I think all of what you've said is precisely what the Afrexim Bank is aiming to do. And then obviously it's supposed to be parallel with what the AFDB provides. So I think the AFDB being the main sort of financing arm of the infrastructure. Obviously there are other multiple alternatives on the continent as well, such as the Europeans also in the market and other international development finance institutions, but also some local ones as well, Botswana, DBSA, etc. And then in terms of the Export Credit Agency, that's precisely what the Afrexim Bank is aiming to provide. Some of their interests can be criticized, such as the lines of credit that they provided to Zimbabwe, which in many instances were used to try and reestablish a local currency, the bond notes, which failed completely. Precisely because it didn't have matching exports in order to earn the dollars and support the currency, and as well as take into consideration what Zimbabweans need as consumer goods. And then my other pushback to what you're saying is that we should be, and I agree with you to a certain extent, we should be trading the raw materials, but for beneficiation. But what you are saying in terms of what we're currently doing, saying that we should be trading that, is not necessarily, I think, a good reflection, because I would say what we trade amongst one another in raw minerals largely reflects those minerals going towards the countries that have an ocean or export in terms of exports from countries that are landlocked. And so, yes, I would definitely want to see a change in the quality of intra-Africa trade for beneficiating these raw minerals. But I wouldn't say that what is currently going on is a good reflection either, because I would say it's largely landlocked countries trying to export those raw materials to be beneficiated somewhere off the continent. But there definitely is a lot more to be done in the space, and particularly to develop just even our trading capacity in consumer goods. For me, I think is a starting point, and then to add the specific additional layers in manufacturing, etc. Sorry, go ahead, Sbu.
Yeah, I was just about to say, I'm in agreement with you, Sia, but what I'm trying to get at is that when you're building infrastructure, and when you're building all these ports, Africa has got some of the worst ports in the world, ranked the worst ports. There's no infrastructure linking these countries, African countries. There are no roads, there are no ICT, there's no networks. Those kind of things. They also are a big add. So those help African companies. That's what I'm getting at.
I'm definitely with you there. Yeah. It's just that the current situation on the continent, obviously it differs according to sector by sector, and I would say energy, for example, has seen a great boom in investment over the last 5 to 10 years. But other sectors, and I agree with you, logistics, rail, for example, and roads have definitely been lacking in many countries. And I think that's mainly because African governments generally don't have a way to bank roads. So we don't have existing tolling that can cover the roads financing in terms of further investment. But even where there are tolls, they don't even come close to actually financing the infrastructure need for investment in roads.
So I think that with regards to this, looking at the different financiers and, who what stakeholders are key in this. For me, I think this is where, your regional communities sort of come into the fore. So looking at SADC and ECOWAS as an example, should have intra-Africa trade at the fore of their agendas, right? Obviously, amongst other initiatives that they would be doing. But I think that strengthening this intra-Africa trade, strengthening intra-Africa trade should come from these regional communities. And I think it will aid in sort of building economies, obviously, that are struggling right now, and provide a catalyst for growth. So I'm agreeing with Spoo to say that joint infrastructure is definitely the way to go. Seeing where countries can boost each other's specialities, and I think that's the way that we can see the African, continent grow and be a superpower like the US and China in a very short space of time, mixed with the fact that we have the youngest demographic of all continents, right? So I think that we really do have to focus on infrastructure. And you've mentioned roads and such. I think that that's an agenda that these regional communities could work on, because this will also, speaking to your point, Sia, improve other aspects such as, other, manufacturing of consumer goods, for example, moving in between, like moving in, the continent. So it'll be difficult to move within the continent if our roads are not set up, So, yeah.
I definitely agree with you guys, and I can't echo the sentiments more than you've echoed them. For infrastructure is, I think, just so critical also in enabling trade. And I totally understand what you're saying, that, the infrastructure obstacle is so bad that it's actually a huge prohibitor of further trade. And I can't agree more. On that note, that takes us to the next story in the SA update: South African water inequality. Minister of Water and Sanitation Mr. Senzo Mchunu has denied that South Africa has a water crisis. Mr. Mchunu has reassured citizens that the 3-day, 54-hour water shutdown in Gauteng province is the result of planned maintenance work on the pipelines. Rand Water CEO Sipho Masai explained that water supply was only being reduced by 600 million litres out of the 4,600 million litres of water supplied to Gauteng daily. However, places like the Nelson Mandela Bay Metropolitan NMBM have been experiencing a prolonged drought due to below average monthly rainfall since November 2015. With dam levels below 15%, the NMBM municipality has asked businesses and households to reduce their water consumption by 20 to 40% or face day zero anytime between November 2021 and April 2022. Zama, you had a point to make about the South African water crisis.
Yes, yeah, honestly, I think the minister denying the fact that South Africa has a water crisis is just somebody who does not want to face reality. South Africa has a water crisis. I think the media is just not focused on it, and nor is our political agenda. I think, our current environmental policy, based on what we've already also covered here on Ubuntunomics, our previous stories, is essentially centered around carbon emissions from a tax perspective. That's what our environmental policy is about. So, when we even think about most recent history, Cape Town suffered a severe drought about 2 years ago, and, everyone was up in arms. So have we forgotten about that? And not only is water supply an issue, but access to such water supply is also a problem across, various provinces, as you've already mentioned, the Eastern Cape, other farming intensive areas like the Northwest. People do not have access to this water. So I just think it's very clear that we do have a water crisis.
Definitely agree with you there, Zam. And in fact, you remind me of a point I made in a story we covered last week on the green hydro plant that's going to be built in the Northern Cape. It's just odd to me that as a water scarce country, we're struggling to even have water in coastal areas such as the Nelson Mandela Bay Metropolitan, And my question was, how are we going to get water all the way up into the desert and of the Northern Cape in order to create blue hydrogen? It's quite absurd. Sbu, you had a similar point about our denialism about this problem.
Yes, it's just strange that this minister reiterates the same statement the previous minister made a year apart, almost to the day, that there's no water crisis in South Africa. Now, this is not according to experts, because they estimate that between 870 billion to 1 trillion rand is needed to resolve water challenges in South Africa. Not to build new dams, but just existing infrastructure. So, like you were saying, like Zama was saying about Day Zero playing out in Cape Town, that city almost became the first metro to run out of water in the entire world. So South Africa is really a water scarce country. And this point is only mentioned partly by government because they don't plan properly, and there are not enough resources allocated to dealing with water and sanitation. So we have this natural reality that we are a water scarce country, and they have been moving forward with trying to build a new development node. They call it the Eastern Seaboard, stretching from Lusikisiki to Port Edward, because there's lots of water that side. So they're trying to build a smart city that side. So meaning there won't be much development in the new cities in the western part of the country. So there's also this tiff between metros and national government about who it is was supposed to be responsible for the provisioning of water in our growing urban centers. Now, government will say it's you, and the city will say, no, it's you, government. So, and also another factor is that there has not been a major announcement from the cities about the construction of new dams or the much touted desalination plants they were talking about. On the part about innovation, I'm thinking these cities have got the tools. They can go out and borrow in the capital markets for new development if they're not getting any joy with the government.
I definitely agree with you, Sbu, and I think whilst politicians are in denial and our metros and local government and national government are squabbling, we're missing opportunities. In fact, I've got a friend who lives in Kariga in the Nelson Mandela Bay Metro who says that recently they've actually seen a recovery in terms of rainfall. But despite this, they haven't been able to capture a lot of that rainfall water because of poor maintenance and poor investment in catchment areas. So I really worry, especially also given the outcome of the previous local elections, where there's a number of hung municipalities and the Nelson Mandela Bay being one of them, that this problem is still going to continue up until it becomes a crisis before we find any sustainable solution to this problem. On that note, that brings us to the last story in the essay update, tax proposals for the 2022 budget. National Treasury has invited the public to submit technical tax proposals to be considered for the possible inclusion in Annexure C of the 2022 budget review. The technical tax proposals requested are limited to unintended anomalies, revenue leakages, loopholes, and technical matters applicable to the current tax legislation that require correction. More substantive tax policy proposals and rate changes are dealt with through a different process, and hence this request does not apply to major tax policy proposals. The closing date for technical submissions is Friday, the 3rd of December, 2021, followed by the virtual stakeholder engagement on 9 and 10 December 2021. Zama, you had a point to make about what technical proposals the public really can make.
Yeah, no, Sia, listen, I'm wondering, what technical proposals could the so-called public provide? Because it is my humble view and opinion that the public does not know much about tax. I think South Africa needs to have a drive around tax. I mean, the only way we can develop is when the masses understand the issues around governance and the issues that affect them, and can thus make a meaningful contribution. So I think there will be no meaningful contribution because people don't really understand, right? We really need to emphasize awareness and education on issues that affect South Africans directly, such as tax, because I mean, when I think about it, just as what you've described, the actual, elements that these submissions, that these technical proposals are allowed for, they sound so complicated. And I mean, they sound like only a tax specialist or a tax lawyer would know what this is about. So, you know, this is, I really like, are we going to have people making meaningful contributions, or are we going to just have people who know everything about the topic making those contributions?
Sure. Look, you raise a very crucial point about public education and public participation. And my response to you is people should be listening to Ubuntunomics podcast. Look, jokes aside, with all sincerity, we do cover a lot in terms of financial and tax policy, whether that be the offsets on carbon tax or Regulation 28, or even the current environmental regulations that government is considering. We cover it all, and I think yes, there's still a lot to be done in terms of educating public and informing public participation. But fortunately, we're doing our little bit as Ubuntunomics podcast. On that note, that brings an end to the essay update this week. And another reminder to our listeners, regardless of whatever platform you're on, please hit the subscribe button so that you can be informed about all the future episodes. And if you're enjoying this episode, hit us with a like or share the episode amongst your family and friends. On that note, that takes us to the Africa Regional Update this week. The first story in the Africa Regional Update is slow progress in Sudan. Sudan recently appointed a new sovereign council following the military coup on 25 October. The council is led by Sudanese military chief General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who led the coup, and the leader of the Rapid Support Forces, Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, will be the deputy. The 14-member council is made up of an additional 3 senior military officers, 6 civilians, and other politicians. Chairperson of the African Union Commission AUC, His Excellency Musa Faki Mahamat, decried the fact that the political actors are still far from reaching consensus on a democratic transition. The AUC chairperson called on the military authorities to engage swiftly on a political process leading to the return of civilian rule in line with the constitutional decree agreed on August 2019 and the Juba Agreement for Peace in Sudan of 3 October 2020. Zama, you had a quite short and poignant point to make about the situation in Sudan.
Honestly, Sia, my simple comment is I don't see democracy happening anytime soon. What are your views on this?
Yeah, look, it's a very dire situation in Sudan, and my biggest worry is that the recent coup has really set back the country in a process where they were trying to recover from the previous coup of, I think, 2 years ago. And it's really set them back, and I worry that the recovery from this is going to be even more difficult than the previous disrupted transition. Sbu, what are your thoughts on this one?
My question is what is happening in Sudan not to be expected? I mean, you've had more than 3 decades of a military government arrangement. The military was at the head, whether you called him a president or not, but he was a military man. So a democratic transition is proving too difficult. And the international community is adopting a hands-off approach in Sudan. Maybe just sometimes this quiet diplomacy it might not be the best way to deal with volatile situations. Zimbabwe comes to mind. Now, I'm not advocating for international interference or the imposition of foreign solutions, but for monetary aid or a moratorium on loan repayment, give these countries some breathing space just for a little while. I mean, the problems in Sudan, we have on this podcast had a number of episodes highlighting that they are not just political. And my view is that had it not been for the tough IMF conditions and the sharp increase in the cost of living, that country could have been less burdened. And the previous transitional government may not have buckled under the economic strain. So I think we need to address the economic alongside.
Definitely. And you might remember that after a long while, the IMF had reached a agreement to provide some debt relief and debt cancellation to Sudan. And I think until the recent coup, this was on the cards and was going to provide quite needed economic relief for the country. But obviously this has all been rolled back and cancelled since the coup d'etat, which really, as I said, is a big challenge that has really taken the country back and set it back by a couple of years. On that note, it brings us to the next story in the Africa Regional Update, SADC Joint Meeting on HIV/AIDS. The Southern African Development Community SADC Ministers of Health and those responsible for HIV and AIDS convened a joint hybrid meeting to review progress made in the implementation of their plan of action in Lilongwe, Malawi. The ministers urged member states to continue to monitor the evolution of the COVID-19 outbreak at both national and sub-national levels. Ministers also urged member states to accelerate the adoption of the multi-sectoral action framework to improve diets of young children. They also urged member states to scale up the implementation of evidence-based targeted HIV prevention interventions. Zama, you had a point to make about the diets of young children.
Yes, I know, something like diet may seem a little bit insignificant, but I think it's actually such a positive development because we see a lot of famine in Africa, as we've covered before, with what we see in Madagascar, what we see in the DRC. And I think that nutrition is just vital for the healthy functioning of the mind and body, which is critical for these young bodies to be able to fight any diseases as well as improving the immune system. So I think it's really positive that they're working on a framework to improve the diets for the young children.
I definitely agree with you there. And, African children really suffer a lot, not only from droughts and malnutrition issues, but also due to the conflicts, as we'll see in the next story. I definitely agree with you there. And, African children really suffer a lot, not only from droughts and malnutrition issues, but also due to the conflicts, as we'll see in the next story. On that note, that brings us to the next story in Africa Regional Update, Impact of CAR Conflict on Children. Children in the Central African Republic, CAR, have suffered a spike in grave violations since the end of 2020. Between 1 July 2019 and 30 June 2021, 1,280 children suffered one or more grave violations, with girls accounting for more than 40% of all victims. Whilst most violations were committed by armed groups, 5% were attributed to the National Armed Forces. With some 845 children affected, child labor is the most prominent of violations, followed by rape and other forms of sexual violence, where at least 249 girls fell victim. Spoo, you had a point to make about how these wars affect children.
Yeah, war deprives children of their rights to be children. I mean, to grow up in an environment that allows them to just be. I mean, these children have been deprived of schooling because armed forces, armed gangs, these rebels have invaded schools, so the kids don't have anywhere to go. And the comfort of growing up in a family, amongst a caring family, it gets taken away from these kids because they are forced to join these rebel groups as child soldiers, and then they get maimed and they get killed in the conflict. The number of sexual violations is most likely underreported for fear sometimes of reprisals or the stigma that is attached to it, because they come from a conservative society. Usually girls get married off at an early age, and this is done at times with the consent of families who think it best to give their kids away, their girl children away, to ensure their safety. Sometimes it is forced on them by men who carry out violence with impunity. So it's a sad story.
Yeah, no, very, very, very sad. Zama, what are your thoughts on this one?
No, definitely. I'm really saddened, and I agree with Spoo's sentiments that there's a high chance that the numbers are not reflecting a full picture of what is actually going on, and that we actually have more victims, more children falling victim to violence and child labor, and I think it's just sad that children who are in early development stages get affected by these conflicts. As I've mentioned before, they are like collateral damage. And now the conflict, not only has long-term impact on the health of the economy from the perspective of actual real economic downturn, but as well as potential economic growth through the stunted growth of human capital, with the kids not being able to study properly, innovate. This definitely impacts the growth potential of these countries.
Yeah, definitely. I think you raise a very crucial point there that is sometimes overlooked. The fact that it's not just the immediate impact and also the future of the country that is put at jeopardy by the impact of these wars on children. On that note, that brings us to the last story in the Africa Regional Update. Ethiopia struggles to find peace. There have been mass arrests of people reportedly of Tigrayan origin in the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa. At least 1,000 individuals are believed to have been detained by police officers in the last week on suspicions of being linked to the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front (TPLF). Many of the detained have not been informed of the charges or reasons for their detention, nor have they been brought before court. The African Union representative in the Horn of Africa, His Excellency Olusegun Obasanjo, is optimistic that common ground toward a peaceful resolution of the conflict can be achieved. According to the AU, the main point of difference between the actors is the means by which they seek to achieve peace, security, and stability in Ethiopia. The AU representative has called for support to the mediation efforts. Spoo, you had a point to make about the history of conflict in Ethiopia.
Yes, the wars in Ethiopia have always taken on an ethnic character, with people belonging to a particular community at a certain time suffering as a consequence of political machinations. Whether these people are politically aligned or not becomes immaterial. I mean, it happened when Emperor Haile Selassie was deposed. The Amhara group lost their prominence since the dynasty came from that group. The victors were from the Oromo group. Mengistu rose, and then when he was deposed by the Tigrayans, that Derg regime, they lost the Derg regime, which had been supported by the Oromo, the Oromo lost their prominence, and then the Tigrayans took up power, and for 3 decades they ruled, and there was a lot of resentment. What brought about this current conflict was the culling of the stranglehold on the army first and Ethiopian politics by people from the province of Tigray. So now we have 5.2 million people in Tigray who are living in survival mode. And there's the 1,000 individuals that have been detained. Not all of them are political actors, and some of them have been detained not because of their political views, but because of their ethnicity. So the ethnic-based federal system in Ethiopia needs to be done away with when negotiations eventually start. It's all to do with ethnicity, and that must be tackled, yeah.
I definitely agree with you. They need to find a way to redraw those federal lines. Otherwise, they will just have successive breakaways from the actual national state. Zama, what are your thoughts on this one?
I just think, well, it's evident that, there's lawlessness and there's, no order in Ethiopia at this point in time. Obviously we're seeing, people getting arrested and not being, brought in front of a court, and 1,000 people. We're seeing UN officials and UN staff as well being arrested. So I just think, as I consider it, I think in this instance we might need to begin thinking about international law prosecution. I think that might need to start being considered. Not just for Ethiopia, but as well as in the case of Sudan as well. Both you, Sia and Spoo, have mentioned that the international community has taken a bit of a silent diplomacy approach when it comes to the conflicts happening here in Africa. And I think we can all agree that that's just not going to work. So I think that perhaps looming prosecution from an international community's perspective, from courts like the ICJ, could serve, the International Court of Justice could serve as a way to deter the gross violations of human rights happening in Ethiopia, Sudan, and the Central African Republic. I don't know what your thoughts are on this.
I just think you'd be very popular amongst the African leaders.
I don't think so.
I'm laughing because it's precisely what people usually are against when it comes to institutions like the ICC, stating that they persecute too many African leaders or they focus on African leaders exclusively. And even in your examples, you might remember that al-Bashir was actually visiting South Africa a couple of years back, and some people viewed our participation in the ICC as a signatory as giving us the obligation to arrest and detain him when he was traveling through our borders as someone who is wanted or has a warrant by the ICC. And it's partly this reason that the last coup d'etat in Sudan wasn't seen as negatively as it should have been, and it didn't garner as much negative response as it should have been, because they ended up prosecuting al-Bashir through the domestic court system. But I want to agree with you on the other part, which is that we need to stop this silent diplomacy issue. And I think it's part of the problem in resolving our conflicts and our political issues on the continent. But I would definitely say that we probably need to have more closer interventions from institutions such as regional economic communities before we actually engage or promote the interventions by international mediators or international litigation, because obviously being closer and the fact that people will own the solution coming out of a local dialogue rather than it being seemingly imposed or even coordinated in some instances by outsiders, which can put pressure on agreements to be made without them having a sustainable foundation in order to lead to a lasting peace. On that note, that brings an end to the Africa Regional Update this week. And that brings us to the numbers game. So the number for this week is $40 million. Zama, you want to give it a go?
Oh my gosh. I don't know. I started off so good at this game and now I'm like, I suck now. Like Spoo has just taken over and I was really, really good. Anyway, 40 million US dollars. I would say, is it like the GDP of, 1 month GDP of a country potentially, maybe?
Okay. $40 million, 1 month's GDP. Small country it must be. Assuming obviously, must be a very small country. Spoo, what are your thoughts?
I much prefer percentages, the big numbers like $40 million. Yeah. Let me see. Let me give it a step and say this is some kind of like aid.
What?
No way. How did you know?
Are you hacking my screen or something?
How do you come up with these things, honestly?
Close. I think I'll give it to you for getting half of the answer correct. I think you're spot on there. So it's actually $40 million in aid relief for Tigray. So I think you were halfway there, Spoo. So the story is that the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UNOCHA, announced an allocation of $40 million to scale up emergency operations in Ethiopia. The funds will help scale up emergency operations in Ethiopia's conflict-affected northern regions and support an early response to the drought in southern Ethiopia. However, humanitarian operations are faced with a funding gap of $1.3 billion throughout Ethiopia. This includes $350 million for the response in Tigray alone. And millions of people in northern Ethiopia are now living on a knife's edge as the humanitarian crisis deepens and widens. So there you have it, folks. $40 million allocated for Ethiopian humanitarian response. A drop in the ocean, if you asked me, but in these critical times, I think something is better than nothing.
Yeah, aid is needed. I mean, in such situations, if you remember way back in, I think it was 1984-85, when they had that big famine in Ethiopia. And that famine was in Tigray. Singers and entertainers came together and there was that song, We Are the World, and they donated lots of money to save the situation. So, yeah, that is me.
Blast from the past, what a throwback. But it's actually quite sad that history is repeating itself in this terrible way in Ethiopia. But on that note, that brings an end to our episode this week. Africa.